Hello and welcome to The Well. I'm your host, Dr. Brendan Arm, Doctor of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine, Chinese medicine herbalist, and founder-director of Lotus Integrative Medicine in Santa Monica, California. There's a wealth of health-related information out there, and I'm joined today by this wonderful group of integrative and holistic medical doctors and practitioners to share some of our favorite wellness tips. Please let me introduce you to Bianca Rodriguez, holistic psychotherapist, Dr. Heath McAllister, a naturopathic doctor and registered herbalist, Leona West, a clinical nutritionist and herbalist, also trained in and certified in functional medicine, and Dr. Rob Krochmal, a medical doctor and a practicing physician who is board certified in family medicine, nutrition, and integrative and holistic medicine. So let's begin. Today's topic is evidence-based medicine. Take it away, Dr. McAllister.
All right. Well, this is a big topic. So, evidence-based medicine is kind of the gold standard of, the type of, conclusions that we draw from research and how we implement that into practice. That's evidence-based medicine. And so, there's pros and cons to that. Obviously, we all want to practice with current evidence. We want to take current research and apply it appropriately to the practice of medicine. I think the kind of greater issues that come to question is the science that's fueling evidence-based medicine, free of bias, let's say, the full picture and without, ulterior motive. And just to give you examples, like, let's say our pharmaceutical industry, which is a huge funder of research. Research doesn't get done unless someone pays for it. Okay. And there are institutions like the National Institute of Health, NIH, that will fund certain research studies, but then, and they have a certain amount of funding that is allotted to them. And then you have pharmaceutical companies that have tremendous budgets because they have tremendous profits. Like if you just take Lipitor, statin drugs, when they were only brand available, they produce billions and billions of dollars for these companies. So they have a lot of liquidity to throw at things like research, to investigate new drugs, investigational drug, INDs, to then develop these drugs that are going to make them more billions and billions of dollars. So there is a vested interest there in certain outcomes being positive. And just to give you an example, in I think it was probably 15 or 20 years ago, there was a drug called Vioxx. Vioxx was an anti-inflammatory drug. And even though in some of the preclinical trials, there were some concerns about cardiovascular events, that wasn't really reported. It wasn't really put out there. And they put the drug on the market. And guess what? People died from it. In my profession, if one person is hurt by an herb one time during a year, it's like a national crisis. It makes the headlines. Whereas properly prescribed pharmaceutical drugs are considered by many sources to be the fourth leading cause of death in this country. So, I just throw that out there as like, there's a double standard here of safety that, just because you're prescribed something and it's maybe medically appropriate for you, it may or may not fit you. It may be counter to your body's ecology, and that's based off of evidence-based medicine. So, we really need to pull the layers apart and say, where are we getting the evidence? Is the evidence free of bias? Like therefore, if the initial body of literature and knowledge is somehow stilted or flawed, then the conclusions that you're going to draw at the end of that are also going to be colored by that. So take it away, folks.
Yeah, and as you're saying, Dr. McAllister, evidence-based medicine kind of was born in some ways out of the notion that as doctors in the 80s and 90s, we didn't necessarily have any data that would tell us whether something worked or not. We might have an intuition, or someone told us that it worked, and we would tell our patients, well, this treatment works or this surgery works. And so on its face, and it continues to be, and none of us are saying we want to throw evidence-based medicine out, but we do want to have a good critique of it. But to that point, there's a doctor named John Ioannidis, who's a Greek physician from the birthplace of science and mathematics, who also happened to be a mathematician, put together a very famous paper that was published that the conclusion was that the majority of research that's being done is incorrect. And he touches upon some of those points that you were making. It's kind of a staggering statement, but kind of puts it out there that so what are the reasons why we have to be skeptical of this, and we can circle back around and talk a little bit more about that.
Wow, that's making me feel really kind of anxious. It's like if we already were feeling uncertainty, that's like adding another level to the uncertainty. But that makes me believe too that in the face of uncertainty, we really have to seek for the truth, and we really have to seek for, questioning things and using critical thinking. Wow, this is a can of worms, gang. I'll let you guys sort
And
it
we
out.
don't want to suggest that that means that we need to deny science, and that that's a whole other topic of science denying completely. But if we have this sort of respectful, thoughtful, intuitive conversation about it, then we can kind of meet somewhere in the middle.
I think
And then
it's
science becomes stronger that way, because we are able to not just accept it at face value.
Mhm.
I think it's about ethics and equity. So their ethics and has to be always first and foremost, and I think that's what we're talking about. And then when we think about advancing our understanding of health and the body, we have to look at equity. And to your point, Dr. McAllister, how much money and attention goes into things that ultimately can be profitable, and then how we study the body with regards to food and other things, they always lag behind. Now, that being said, we certainly have had a revolution of research come out, especially around the gut microbiome. I mean, things that we probably were talking about in our practice when we first started, that now is a consensus where there was so much pushback. So we certainly have advanced, but when you can't take something in nature, you can't patent nature. And so there's not a lot of attention, there's not a lot of money. But oftentimes we find the safest support in nature. And so there's this big discrepancy between funding and research around food and things that are, come from nature. But I think that gap has been closed more so recently than ever, but there's still a big discrepancy there.
And also, when you're talking about nature, we're talking about nature is all about relationships, and you're talking about the microbiome, and you think about, gosh, we have 100 trillion microorganisms in our gut. We only have 37 trillion human cells in our body. And when we're talking about evidence-based medicine, it's often a reductionist kind of approach, and it needs to be, because how can you draw a conclusion unless you're eliminating variables and looking at one thing or two things or one outcome. Whereas now, as you said, gastroenterologists were absolutely skeptical of the microbiome 10 years ago. And now you look at publications and it seems like they invented the whole idea when you look at what they're writing about. But it can be very, very tricky in the sense that, as you're saying, thankfully, medicine is moving toward a more holistic approach, a more individualized approach. You're even starting to hear that from Western medicine, that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And so that is another one of the risks of evidence-based medicine, that this treatment works, or, and then do doctors take that and say, for all of my patients, this is what you're going to do if you have this lab value. And it makes it easy to practice medicine. It makes it easy to do something in a 5-minute visit, but it doesn't necessarily pan out in reality, no matter what the conclusion of the paper might have been.
Yeah, I think that for things like innovation and, science should be a systemic body of knowledge that is constantly reevaluating itself and adding to itself and improving itself. And I think that we as humans tend to get stuck in certain patterns of thinking, and that stuckness has prevented us from moving forward a lot of times. There's a good example of an Australian researcher who was the guy who really pioneered, the diagnosis of most gastric ulcers and duodenal ulcers as the causative agent being a bacteria called H. pylori. This is probably back, I think, the 70s or 80s. And he was like lambasted. Like his reputation was dragged through the dirt and people said, that's crazy. It's just stress, or it's this or that, hyperacidity. And guess what? It's like 70 to 100% of ulcers are from this bacteria. And so to be a pioneer and try and really represent data that may be conflicting with prior data, it's like you paint a big circle on your back. It's a big risk in science. So some people may not have the courage to do that. Again, we like to think of ourselves, especially as doctors, as like, you know, kind of more objective, but even we have our own biases. Like we are creatures of habit, and science doesn't really get revised. The practice of science is like, it's almost like a 10-year lag time. That research that came out 10 years ago, which is the microbiome, now we're talking about that. You know, we're talking about diet and microbiome in terms of like, you know, Mark Pimentel writes the new IBS solution as if it's like some revelation that you might want to look at your microbiome for your IBS. And like, this is a revelation, whereas everyone used to just say it was just stress. So I think, you know, accumulating more data, but also having data that is not just geared toward understanding the body in terms of what drug will affect the body. Like, we're not pouring tons of data into like, what kinds of diets are best for your body, or what kind of movements, or their breathing exercises that might help your digestion. Like, no, there's no money in that. Like, you know, I'm sure if you research dandelion root, you'd say, oh my gosh, it's like, it has incredible benefits for, you know, hepatitis and for this and that. But guess what? There's no money in dandelion root. So nobody's doing that research. Or if they do it, they do a 20-person study, and people will say, you know, that N of 20 is like not powerful enough to draw conclusions. It's a problem. It's like a super problem. So I wish we had, I love science. I love the practice of research. I love when you have a really well done research article and you can draw solid conclusions. Like, that's what we should all want as scientists and as thinkers. And I think we rarely get that. And so we're kind of like making do with what we've got. Like, you know, the pearls, the few pearls of wisdom we can glean from our science apparatus is the best that we've got.
I mean, I think it really goes back to, you know, critical thinking. It's like, right, knowing where your food comes from is also, you know, knowing where research comes from. And you guys are taking me back to my research methods class, you know, in my first year of graduate school, of looking at, you know, what was the intention of the researcher and what was their kind of like, is there a bottom line associated with it? Like, is it being funded by someone? Why might the researcher want this theory that they have to be proven correct? And so really being able to look at, you know, there's so much news, there's so much media, you know, sometimes doing like that extra step to be like, I'm just curious, you know, who published the study? Who did this research? What might their bias be? Why might they want, you know, the answer to be that this drug that they have created is going to work for everybody and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I think that's about, you know, knowing where the information is coming from.
Right, and that data is electively reported. Like, you don't have to report all of your data. Like, you know, you could throw out a patient population, say, oh, well, in the over 65 population, this drug doesn't do very well, you know, so let's exclude that from our data sample set and just focus on, you know, like there's different ways of massaging data and representing data. And again, that's not science. That is like an intent. You're trying to gear towards a specific outcome, not science. That's bias.
There's some type of you know, third party impartial that, you know, has to review this data, you know, that's you know,
yeah, there is, but it's the data that's been given. It's the data that's been provided. So yes, if you're going to publish an article, there's, you know, peer reviewed literature. So like the Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, you know, all of these different journals will review that study, but they may not see all the data.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, if the data doesn't look good, they may not publish it.
Sure.
So yeah, they may only publish the ones that come out positive.
Totally.
Or there can be, let's say there's so many researchers out there, which is great. I love science too. But let's say there's 20 different teams working on a problem. In order to publish a study and say that it's statistically significant, it has to be less than a 5% chance that it happened by chance alone. So if you got 20 people working on a problem and one of them says that it's positive, that's the 5%, and the other 19 don't publish, then you have a positive study there.
Right.
But I think to your point, Bianca, you know, one of the ways to get around this is to start to look at a more holistic way of looking at things, rather than just accept a conclusion of a paper, to bring it into reality. Like, what's the power of this study? What does this mean for my life, basically? You know, and there's an example would be some cancer drugs, for example, that have been approved, that let's say it's a $200,000 treatment that gives you an extra 2 months of life. Now, cost is one thing. Is that $200,000 worth it for that individual? But even more so is that individual has to go to the hospital every day for those 2 months to get an infusion versus being at home with their family. Is that worth it? And so you can say that drug works, but if you really think about bringing that into the reality of your life and the ethics, as you're talking about, Leona, of everything, then you have a better idea of, you know, what conclusions you want to draw from that research.
Are there certain sources that you guys prefer, professionally, that you like to go through, like PubMed, or there are certain?
I go to PubMed all the time. I troll PubMed. I'll do
Me
keyword
too.
searches and I'll look for all kinds of things, and then I'll read the study and I'll look at their conclusions. I'll look at their methods and I'll be critical about that. But yeah, PubMed, yeah, absolutely. I look in that all the time. It's a great resource, and it's going to be full of bias also, because a lot of that research is going to be geared toward wanting certain outcomes. So you have to take everything with a grain of salt. You know, like I said, the evidence, if the evidence is built on a swamp, right, then it's easy to fall into that swamp. It's easy to just have data that isn't as, the conclusions you draw are only as good as the data that you have.
Yeah, I mean, there's good. I like the British Medical Journal, so I go to BMJ a lot, and I'm trolling PubMed too. There's information everywhere. It's just, I think, taking that critical thinking and looking through the lens of ethics and equity when we are looking at data.
Good point.
And that point about equity, I think, is going to be for part 2, because, thinking about the field of psychology and how a lot of the theories that were created, studies that were done, were based on, white men. And so, right, a lot of the lens that we use in psychology, some of the, people who Freud and all the folks that we talk about all the time, it's like, they were really applying this to a white male perspective. And so I think that's the other thing too. And then when we're talking about, money, and the people with the money are the people funding, a lot of this research, and how does this affect populations that are underserved, and populations that are, neglected and overlooked. So I think we're going to have to get into that next time.
Awesome.
Well, that's all the time we have today. If you have a topic you'd like to learn more about, let us know with a comment on social media. And also don't forget to subscribe to our The Well YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us, and please join us next year for more wellness tips. Remember, regardless of where we are, our resources in The Well are limitless.